The Young and the Restless Spoilers. After so many endless days with Dominic missing, something inside Abby finally began to fracture beyond repair. At first, there had been denial, then fragile hope, then exhaustion, but now what remained was raw panic and unfiltered terror that wrapped itself around her chest and refused to loosen its grip. Sleep no longer came easily, and when it did, it brought no rest, only fractured images of Dominic's face, his voice calling out to her from somewhere she could not reach. Abby could no longer regulate her emotions. She could not slow her breathing or quiet her thoughts. Every sound in the house startled her. Every silence felt like an accusation. She paced endlessly, sobbing, her body trembling as if it were constantly bracing for another blow. The absence of her son had become a physical presence, a wound that throbbed with every passing hour, and no reassurance, no logical explanation, could fill the space Dominic had left behind. She screamed Mariah's name into the phone over and over, her fingers shaking as she redialed again and again, each unanswered call pushing her closer to the edge. The lack of response was unbearable, not just because it meant Dominic was still out of reach, but because it suggested something darker, something intentional. Abby's cries became desperate, almost feral, as if sheer volume might somehow force Mariah to answer, might tear through whatever barrier stood between her and her child. Devin stayed close, never leaving her side, wrapping his arms around her whenever her legs threatened to give out, murmuring words of comfort he no longer believed could truly help. He told her to breathe, told her they would find Dominic, told her she was not alone, but even as he held her, he could feel the same unease creeping into his own thoughts. Comfort felt hollow now. Reassurance sounded like a lie. The question neither of them could escape was simple and horrifying. If Mariah was truly in control, then what did that mean for Dominic? While Abby was unraveling, Mariah was unraveling too, though in a very different way. What had once felt like devotion had curdled into resentment, and what she told herself was protection now felt more like imprisonment. Dominic was no longer the compliant child she could soothe and manage. He had begun to resist, to question, to pull away. His restlessness exhausted her. His defiance frightened her. He talked about leaving, about finding his mother, about escaping, and every word felt like a betrayal. Mariah was tired, emotionally drained, mentally frayed, and the pressure of keeping control was becoming unbearable. The more Dominic pushed back, the tighter she clung, convincing herself that losing him would mean losing everything. Her fear twisted into something sharper, something dangerous, because fear without an outlet always does. When Abby finally managed to connect through a video call, the relief was so intense it almost knocked the air from her lungs. The screen flickered, and there was Mariah, real and present, and for one fleeting second Abby allowed herself to believe that this meant Dominic was safe. That this nightmare might still end without irreversible damage. Their faces mirrored each other, one ravaged by grief, the other hardened by strain, and the tension between them was immediate and suffocating. Abby broke down instantly, her voice cracking as she begged Mariah to listen, to stay calm, to stop whatever this had become before it went too far. She promised everything and anything, insisting she would comply with any demand Mariah made if it meant Dominic would not be harmed. Her pleas were not calculated. They were instinctive, born of a mother's terror, stripped of pride, reason, and dignity. All that mattered was her child. Mariah listened, holding Dominic tightly against her chest, her grip more possessive than comforting. There was no softness in her eyes now, only resolve sharpened by desperation. She warned Abby that if she kept pushing, if she refused to accept the new reality, then she would never see Dominic again. The threat was not shouted. It did not need to be. It hung in the air, heavy and deliberate, and its quiet delivery made it all the more terrifying. Abby's heart seemed to stop as the words sank in. The implication was unmistakable. Dominic was leverage, and Mariah was prepared to use him. Whether she truly believed she could disappear forever or was simply clinging to the illusion of control no longer mattered. The damage was already done. Dominic struggled, calling out for his mother, his voice breaking through the tension like a knife. Abby screamed his name, reaching for the screen as if touch alone might bridge the distance between them. For a moment, their voices overlapped, mother and son crying out to one another, a sound so raw and heartbreaking that it seemed impossible anyone could remain unmoved by it. Devin stood frozen beside Abby, helpless as he watched her unravel completely, powerless to intervene as the situation slipped further out of reach. Mariah's expression flickered not with remorse, but with panic as Dominic's distress escalated, and in that moment it became clear that she was losing control not just of the situation, but of herself. Then the screen went dark. The call ended abruptly, without warning or explanation, plunging the room into a silence so profound it felt violent. Abby screamed again, her voice tearing through the air as she tried to reconnect, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. Devin pulled her into his arms as she collapsed, her sobs uncontrollable now, her body racked with anguish. The unanswered call, the black screen, the echo of Dominic's voice, each element combined into something unbearable. They shouted Mariah's name, shouted Dominic's name, as if sound alone might undo what had just happened, but there was no response. Only the hollow realization that whatever fragile connection they had was gone. In the aftermath, the house felt smaller, heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Abby's screams gradually gave way to broken, gasping sobs, but the panic did not subside. It settled deeper, embedding itself into her thoughts, her breath, her heartbeat. Devin held her, feeling the same dread coil in his own chest, knowing that this was no longer just a disappearance, no longer just a misunderstanding. This was a power struggle, a psychological breaking point, and Dominic was trapped at its center. The silence that followed was not calm, it was ominous, charged with the knowledge that something had shifted, something irreversible. And as Abby cried out into the emptiness, one truth became painfully clear. Whatever Mariah had started, it was far from over, and the next move could cost them everything. The hours that followed the severed call dissolved into something shapeless and cruel, a stretch of time that refused to move forward yet somehow kept slipping away. Abby sat rigid, eyes fixed on the darkened phone screen as if it might light up again through sheer willpower, her body trembling with aftershocks of panic that refused to settle. Devin stayed close, anchoring her with his presence, but even his steadiness could not penetrate the fog that had settled over her mind. Every breath felt borrowed, every thought looping back to the same unbearable image of Dominic crying out, reaching for her, being pulled back by hands she could not see. The silence in the room grew oppressive, not empty but crowded with everything left unsaid, with threats that had been spoken quietly yet carried the weight of a scream. Abby's grief shifted into something sharper now, something edged with fury and guilt, because beneath the terror was a truth she could not escape. She had just begged another person for permission to be a mother, and that humiliation burned almost as much as the fear. Devin tried to guide her back toward reason, reminding her that panic would not bring Dominic home, that they needed to think, to plan, to act. But logic struggled to find footing against the rawness of Abby's emotions. Her mind replayed the call again and again, dissecting every second, every look in Mariah's eyes, searching for signs she might have missed. She wondered when things had shifted so completely, when concern had curdled into control, when love had begun to resemble captivity. The realization that Mariah herself might be unraveling only deepened the dread, because unpredictability was the most dangerous element of all. Abby understood instinctively that Dominic was no longer simply hidden, he was entangled in someone else's emotional collapse, and that made every outcome more volatile. Elsewhere, far from the room where Abby's sobs had finally quieted into exhausted silence, Mariah paced with restless energy, Dominic's cries echoing in her ears long after the call had ended. Ending the connection had felt necessary in the moment, an act of self-preservation as much as control, but now it left behind an unsettling void. Dominic's resistance gnawed at her, his tears stirring something she refused to examine too closely. She told herself that cutting off contact was for his own good, that Abby's hysteria would only make things worse, that distance was protection. Yet even as she clung to these justifications, doubt crept in, whispering that she was losing her grip, that the line between safeguarding and imprisoning had already been crossed. The more she tried to silence that voice, the louder it became. Dominic, meanwhile, had grown quiet in a way that frightened her more than his earlier outbursts. His small body sagged with exhaustion, his eyes glassy with tears he no longer had the strength to shed. He asked for his mother again, softly this time, the question less a demand than a plea, and Mariah felt something inside her fracture further. She tightened her hold, not to comfort him but to reassure herself that he was still there, that he had not slipped away. The irony was cruel and unmistakable. The tighter she held on, the more she risked pushing him beyond her reach forever. Back at home, Abby's despair gradually transformed into resolve, a brittle determination born from the knowledge that waiting was no longer an option. Devon recognized the shift immediately, seeing in her eyes the same fierce protectiveness that had driven her through every crisis before. Together, they began to retrace steps, to examine patterns, to consider possibilities they had previously dismissed. Every detail of Mariah's behavior, every inconsistency, every moment of silence became a potential clue. Abby's guilt remained heavy and unrelenting, but it now fueled her rather than paralyzed her. She refused to accept a future in which Dominic's fate was decided by someone else's instability. As night deepened, sleep remained elusive for all of them. Abby lay awake, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios she could not shut out, while Devon stared into the darkness, calculating risks, preparing himself for confrontations he knew were coming. The uncertainty was its own form of torture, stretching nerves thin, eroding patience, amplifying fear. Somewhere out there, Dominic was awake too, separated from everything familiar, caught in the crossfire of adult emotions he could not possibly understand. What none of them yet realized was that the balance had already shifted again. The threat Mariah had made, whether intended as a warning or a bluff, had changed the stakes irrevocably. Abby would no longer negotiate from a place of desperation alone, and Mariah would soon discover that control gained through fear is the most fragile kind of power. As dawn crept closer, bringing no relief, only clarity, one truth loomed larger than all the others: the next move would define everything, and there would be no easy way back from whatever came next.